Okay. Thank you guys for joining us. We're here today with two professors from Adelphi's School of Education. Suraj Uttamchandani is a professor that teaches primarily in learning sciences. He holds a PhD in learning sciences from Indiana. Matt Curinga is here with us. He teaches primarily in educational technology and he holds an EDD from Columbia. Um, you guys have both, you know, kind of been here at Adelphi, both as instructors and as people that are preparing instructors to go out into the world. And so basically, what, I would like to know is to kind of get an idea of where you guys think AI is now versus a couple of years ago, um, and where you guys think it's headed. So, Matt, maybe if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so many exciting, interesting, terrible things going on with artificial intelligence and teaching and learning. I mean, one thing that Suraj and I and our colleagues are interested about is as we studying like intelligence and learning, like what can we learn from looking at machine models? What does it tell us about how people learn things? I mean, already with large language models, we see that we're kind of reconceiving how human intelligence might learn language, right? Because computers learn it differently than our best thoughts of how humans learned it. And it could be they're just total like parallel models, and humans don't learn it at all the way that like an LLM does, but maybe there are some things we didn't understand. And there are all kinds of things like that that we don't know about yet that we can learn more about by um, trying to better understand how like new AI models work. So that's one thing I'm interested in. I know for your class, you're probably interested in like, what is a teacher going to do with this? How are we going to grade any written work ever again? I don't have good answers to that second question, although it's something that we've definitely been talking a lot about and thinking about.
Hmm. Suraj, do you wanna add
Yeah.
anything? Where do you think AI is right now?
So when people talk about ed tech, they always get kind of hung up on the newest inventions, but ed tech is actually a very old field, kind of starting from communications technologies. And so in some ways, you have some people who are like, this is just the next in a wide variety of things that happened that we think shifted everything and turned out to not have that much impact. About 12 or 13 years ago, there was this big moment around massive open online courses, MOOCs, and there was
Yeah.
all of this talk about how MOOCs would kind of was spelled the end of formal education, and that all turned out to be a lot of nothing. So there certainly are some folks who think that this is not the paradigm shift that it's being framed as, but rather just another one of the many kind of new technologies that roll around and will continue to be something we adapted to. But there are lots of other people who see this as a qualitative shift, something that is really going to change the nature of education. I think for me, it's important to distinguish between generative AI and AI. So the kinds of AI that folks are studying in your class, some of it is, of course, really advanced AI technology that might, early detect breast cancer or something like this. And so a lot of times the conversation about AI in education is tacitly, but forgets to spell out, talking about the role of generative AI. Basically, since ChatGPT has been publicly available, that has been the majority of the conversation about AI in education. But there has been lots of work on AI in education before this that has dealt with various other topics like how to support teachers in processing learner data or how to facilitate grading or how to kind of provide collaborative supports for groups of students just in time in rooms with only one teacher. And some of that work is quite interesting. But now I would agree that the major question facing AI in education is how do we cope with the idea that learners have access to generative AI? How is this affecting their learning? Is it
Mhm.
something that we should be working to protect against? And how do we kind of teach in this new world of generative AI in ways that support the learning goals that we're looking for? There are plenty of people who argue that we should be teaching students how to use AI. There are plenty of people who argue that AI has no place in the classroom. And there's lots of folks in between. Personally, as we're about to get into it, personally, I'm quite anti the use of generative AI in the classroom, and I'm happy to explicate why I think that. But in this conversation, it might be interesting to kind of talk about some of the issues that are facing folks and how people are thinking about generative AI right now and the various ranges of responses people have had to the idea that AI is now in the classroom.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. So if I can think through what you guys said, on the one hand, you have kind of the very important, I think, long-term academic question of how do teachers use AI either from what Matt said because as a model for learning, right? Or or um, just from the practicality of the fact that the students will have it. So on the one hand, you have this very real, I guess, learning sciences question, and on the other hand, you have some of the other stuff, Suraj, that you were talking about, which I think of more kind of the logistics of teaching, like going into the classroom and doing things every day, things like facilitating grading, um, maybe, for example, some longer term lesson plans or even some shorter term brainstorming ideas for lesson plans, stuff like that. So I think that this is interesting because they're kind of two questions and it sounds like they're also in a sense kind of two time scales, right? On
Yeah.
the one hand, you have this big open question, how do we use AI for learning? And on the other hand, you have this logistical question, which I think a lot of teachers are embracing, which is like, how can I use AI, whether it's generative or something else? How do I use AI in my everyday life to become a better teacher? Does that sound right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think um, just from my practice as a teacher, as faculty member, I think that I want to be open to what new possibilities there are with ChatGPT or other like Gen AI models. And for me, the first step is like to try to use it. Like, what if it actually lived up to the hype? What would that look like? And where does that connect with what I actually want for my students or for my teaching, right? Because um, what I don't want is to just choose like the easiest things and then use them because that's what the technology lets me do.
Mm-hmm.
So if let's say I have a goal that I want my students to really be in charge of their own learning and to like make their own decisions and be responsible for teaching themselves things that they are passionate about, right? Like that's probably what my teaching philosophy is at the end of the day. Like I want them to realize they don't need me and they can direct their own learning and know how to take charge of that. So then I'm like, let me see what ChatGPT can do to help me do that. And my first step is just like to try to really get to know it as deeply as I can. But
Mm-hmm.
to keep those goals in mind, because I'm sure it can like write a book report, but I don't want my students to write book reports anyway. Like that's like the lowest level of the type of academic work I want them to do. So I know it can do that, and it's like, yeah, you can use it to summarize an article for you, sure. But like, who cares? Like that's, we've had Cliff Notes for 40 years or whatever. It's the same thing. It's nothing. It's not going to revolutionize how we think about teaching and learning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Suraj, you said that you're very anti using AI in the classroom and kind of a beforehand. So am I. But if you want to kind of explain, or at least in the vast majority of classroom, but if you'd like to kind of explain a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah. So I do want to stress that, like, I think there are some uses of AI that are quite interesting and novel, but I'm just thinking about, like, I don't know, your typical 10th grade class, right?
Yeah.
Um, I have kind of all the regular problems that people have with AI. So, for example, the idea that much of OpenAI's data set was taken illegally, no compensation to the authors for the training materials, trained on all sorts of, books and novels that nobody gave their permission to be trained in this way. There's all sorts of labor issues, who is actually doing this less so with ChatGPT, but lots of these AI systems are not actually artificial intelligence. They're being outsourced to other kinds of places where people sit in front of computers all day and geotag things, and it's passed off as computer vision, but it actually isn't. What Jeff Bezos famously called artificial intelligence. There's the environmental costs and the data centers, all of these kinds of the idea that Google kind of ended their net zero carbon emissions pledge when they introduced their AI. So there's all of that good stuff. And of course, in the New York Times, we're seeing increasingly reports of AI conversations sending people into mass delusion, sending people into, there was this horrifying article about this teenager who was kind of talking about his suicidal ideation with the AI. And I think reasonably, the journalists concluded that the AI kind of wound up encouraging him to take that action. And so I have all of those usual problems, but it might be helpful for our conversation. And it sounds like you've talked about some of these things with lots of other professionals and lots of other places. So for our conversation, if we think about the teaching and learning, a good question is like, what is your theory of learning? So there are theories of learning that are really interested in the idea that people learn when they're in social interaction and can think critically about the idea of the AI as an interactant. And so a conversational partner that can actually advance your thinking the same way that your thinking gets advanced when you talk to a friend. Maybe the AI can actually do that for you, right? And be the person who you're bouncing back between. These are models called distributed cognition. So the idea that your cognition is kind of offloaded and spread out throughout lots of different people and artifacts. But then there's also a theory of learning that we might call constructivism, which is the idea that you construct your own understanding in your brain, and anything you understand is something that you had to kind of build that understanding manually by yourself. And there is the idea that the AI providing you that understanding might compromise your ability to understand it yourself or construct that understanding yourself.
Rob you of the chance to learn it for yourself, right?
Yeah, that is like an extreme case of constructivism. So not all constructivists believe that. Certainly some do. And if you are somebody who believes that when you ask students to write something, it's because you think that the process of writing that thing is going to help them clarify their ideas, then you're less interested in the product and what the product of that writing represents about their thinking. And you're more interested in the idea that they took the time to think through their ideas about something and work through them in writing. And so then when the ChatGPT produces some writing for them, they've missed the opportunity to understand their own thinking about some particular topic or develop it. And it's that piece that I'm concerned about. In my classes, Matt talked about his teaching philosophy, and I think we all share these kinds of similar goals for the students. And in my classes, I want the students to basically think through tough ideas. And I assign writing, reflect on this idea, think through this situation, and write to me about what do you think about it? And when that writing is AI produced, then it doesn't reflect the student's thinking, it reflects the AI's thinking. And so then when I enter into a conversation with them about their writing, where I say, oh, you said this, that made me think about this other thing, and I wonder how you're thinking about it, I'm actually giving feedback to the AI and not the student. And that is kind of the crux of my concern.
Yeah, there's a book that I read to my freshmen every year in the math orientation seminar called How to Solve It by Polya. And yeah, and one of the really beautiful quotes there is that the struggle is the point, and as an instructor myself, I fear that I do fear that and it's a little bit of both, right? Like part of the reason why, at least in math, we get academic study groups together, right, is because people have this common struggle, and I fear that not only will just having an AI do whatever, right, write whatever, solve the proofs. I fear not only does that, like you said, Matt, rob them of the ability to struggle, but because you don't have that common motivation, it robs them of the necessity of forming those social bonds, which can lead to success later on.
Yeah,
but it's good to hear that from you guys, because you actually know what you're talking about.
I think, I mean, part of it, part of my problem with it or thinking about it is it just kind of lays bare like these underlying problems that we haven't been dealing with in education of over-reliance on grades, of credentialing, like of basically students being told their whole lives that they shouldn't care about what they're learning about for what they're learning about, right? When you go to your math study group, why would you use an AI proof? Like it just doesn't even make any sense, right?
Mhm.
If we're doing a reading group, like I'm not gonna read something ChatGPT wrote about the book that we're talking about. That's just stupid. But for
Yeah.
a student, it's not stupid at all because they've been told they need a degree, they need a grade, they need a GPA, they need a score on an SAT, on a GRE. And that's why they go to school. That's why they study. That's why they're learning. So if they can do it faster, better with ChatGPT, that's all they've ever learned throughout their whole schooling. So it's so now that we're like, oh, um, I can't believe they used ChatGPT for this. Like, of course they used it for it, right?
Mhm.
Like the other cheating didn't work as well before. Otherwise, they would have done it. And a lot of students already were using all kinds of things, right? Um, it was actually about 2 semesters before GPT-3 that my computer science students were using like all those online like tutoring services to do their
Yeah. Yeah.
their
Prepare
labs.
and
So
stuff.
it
Yeah.
had actually happened like 2 semesters before they could just like not even bother to pay the $15 or whatever to get the answers. So, you know,
Yeah, I think Matt's point is a good one. And an illustration of it in my own teaching has been my changing relationship with grading the students. So 5 years ago, I would say, write this reflection about the stuff we read this week and, submit it and I'll grade it. And if the reflection was, poorly written, I would deduct points. And now in this current era, I have learned that what that does is it incentivizes somebody to ask ChatGPT to either edit or produce their response. And then
Mhm.
I get something that I can tell is not written by the student. And I really had to reflect on this idea that I just articulated, that the writing reflects the thinking. And so what I wound up saying to students more recently is, like, I want to see that the writing that you have is your writing, and I want to be in conversation with you about your thinking. And I'm using your writing as a proxy for your thinking. So if you give me writing that isn't yours, I'm talking to not you. And I said, but that means that I cannot deduct points for what I describe as poor quality writing,
Right.
because that's actually sending this kind of mixed message to the student. I'm telling you one thing, but my actions are belying that I actually care more about the quality of writing than I've said that I did. And I think that's an illustration of Matt's point that we teach the students how we want them to learn in our grading policies and things like this. And it's true that, my kind of focus on this writing quality and lots of other instructors' focus on that sent the message that we actually care more about the writing product than the writing process. And now I've had to kind of adjust my classes to highlight that actually, no, I don't. I care more about the process. And so my grading policy has to evolve accordingly.
yeah. And just anecdotally, like faculty are relieved when they get typos and spelling errors now in a written response. You're like, oh, thank God, at least the student wrote it, right? Your terrible grammar shows me that you did the reading and thought about what you were going to submit. So,
That's funny.
yeah,
So something that I think is interesting is that I feel like math as a discipline has had something of a leg up in this because since Stephen Wolfram released Wolfram Alpha to on the internet the early 90s, um, any student that's at like Calc 2 or well even higher, any student that's at we'll call it complex variables or lower in course since 91, 92 can go on and like type in almost any problem a professor could give them and it'll just give you the answer
right.
and on occasion it's wrong. And so I think that that kind of 30-year intro has played out and now the standard math grading rubric is a bunch of homeworks that mean very little to the grade, right? They're allowed mastery
Yeah,
uh, grading is done very often, or they're graded by completion, or they just have a very small percentage. And then a large proportion in-person exams and grading and things like that, right? We have very few, traditionally we have very few like take-home tests. We have a few essays and stuff, which is funny because that's not like how professional mathematicians work, right? So like writing is a big part. Writing an exposition is a big part of being a professional mathematician, but it is how we teach. And I wonder if this same kind of, if that's kind of going, it seems to me that as I talk to my colleagues, for example, in the humanities, that seems to be where they want to go. Like Matt, you said, for example, people are doing like in-person writing
Yeah.
prompts and stuff like that, as
Right.
opposed to doing outside. So
Yeah.
that seems to be like what we've done in math as a result of very early math-centered AI. And I wonder if you think that maybe that's going to be kind of the default path forward, or if something else might happen in other disciplines. Suraj, if you have any ideas or comments on it.
Is this a math class or a computer science class, this one that we're talking to today?
This is a class in the AIs, in the
The
AI
new
masters.
program.
So
Sure.
we'll say yes.
Okay. Well, I think even before Wolfram Alpha in math, there was the calculator, and there was the idea that there are calculator tests and non-calculator tests, and even now on something like the AP exam or what have you, there is a calculator section and then a non-calculator section. And it does kind of illustrate a question that gets asked, which is why would we learn something that the calculator can do for us? And I think there is an interesting answer to that question, and it has to do with the ability to know whether or not the calculator is right and the ability to understand what the calculator is doing. So, it's something that Goodwin calls professional vision, or Rogers Hall and Reed Stevens calls disciplined perception. And it's a quality that experts have. Experts in any particular field have this kind of disciplined perception or this professional vision where they can very clearly, from a large amount of information or a complex situation, figure out what's important and what's working and what they should pay attention to. And this is true for geologists. It's true for teachers who know how to focus on exactly the right thing, expert teachers, in order to make the classroom, occur. It's obviously the case for researchers and all like this. And how do we develop that quality where we kind of can evaluate the output of something as good or bad? And I think that is another risk you have, right? Is so suppose that you ask ChatGPT to prove something for you, some math proof, and then it generates a proof. Where did you get the ability to know whether or not the proof that it has produced for you is true, a correct logical deduction?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a non-trivial question when it comes to ChatGPT. The calculator, the TI-84, is pretty reliable. ChatGPT is actually quite unreliable. It will frequently freak out at certain kinds of problems, and you might tell it divide this group of 20 students into 6 groups of 3, and it will create 7 groups of 3 and multiply, like double one student, whatever, because it can't really understand what you're trying to get it to do. And it will make up citations famously. ChatGPT is citation hallucinator. It just makes them up, which makes sense if you understand how large language models work and what's actually going on in the background. And so I don't remember what question I'm answering. I'm just going off on a whole nother thing, which is this evaluative quality.
Right.
Like, how can you actually prepare a student to understand the output of ChatGPT? And I think a lot of the advocates for ChatGPT in the classroom who are saying things like teach the students how to use ChatGPT take for granted the idea that the student can read what ChatGPT sends it and decide if it's good or bad. But that is actually not the case. A classic example is in the case of good writing. And we've seen this before ChatGPT, where students will sometimes, all of us will have seen this, I'm sure. Students will produce something and you'll read it and you'll be like, what is this? Like, I can't really follow this. And you say to the student, like, what are you trying to say here? And they say, well, I wrote it this way, but then I tried to make it sound more academic. And then you're like, well, that actually didn't work because your perception of what was more academic actually made it harder to read. And how do we develop that idea of what is or isn't good prose? I got to tell you, for those of us who read a lot in a lot of different places, whether that's fiction, nonfiction, research, whatever, you can actually start to feel the particular feel of ChatGPT style prose, and it's not particularly good. It's not going to win any awards anytime soon for creative writing, which we can go down that adventure. So my point is, how do you kind of develop that perception? And we cannot take for granted the idea that students can actually read what ChatGPT says and evaluate it as good or bad or high quality or good writing or correct, even factually correct, unless they have previously developed those skills, which is one and the same as what we're trying to teach. How do you develop the skill to know if a proof is or isn't a good logical deduction? You do a lot of proofs. Also, not for nothing, in the math class, a lot of these proofs that you do, they are proven. Nobody is stopping you from looking up the proof of Cantor's theorem. You can do it. Go look it up. We all agree, and many serious math students agree with this, that the important part is getting your mind to create the proof, not the idea that nobody has ever proved Cantor's theorem before. And that's the powerful mathematical activity that is very satisfying to serious students of math.
Yeah.
One thing that you brought up, Suraj, this idea of like the disciplined expert perception of it. Like for me, in my own like research, right? So I write a lot of code, do like trying to develop novel programs to do interesting things, right? And I always use ChatGPT and I always use Copilot in my editor. Like I can't, for the last like year and a half, now I can't imagine writing software without AI. Like it's just so tedious. Either to look up documentation and like read through like Stack Exchange, or just like I have this whole thing and I want to refactor it, and I can just say like, hey, generate the test code for this, and then just save me all that time. And that's just like that's not like a revolution. That's just like an evolution of what IDEs have been doing. But at the same time, for like the more scholarly stuff, I never use it. If I'm writing a paper and I'm like trying to articulate a new idea, I would never bring it in to that work because it's not useful to me. So for my students, like I wouldn't say like you can't use ChatGPT when you're writing computer software, because I use it all the time. It just seems awkward and unfair and like doesn't make sense. So that's where I want them to start to think about it the way I think about it. Like, did it generate code for you? Does it do what you want it to do? Is it wrong? Like, are you wasting your time? Would it be easier for you to just do it yourself? Um, to know those things that I can see quickly. And I see that they can't see them and they just like paste stuff in and it's never going to work. And then they actually get themselves into like a hole, but they do need to develop that idea. And it is part of like being a professional computer scientist or a professional software engineer. I'd never want someone to graduate with a CS degree and not know how to use like ChatGPT or Copilot. Like it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and Matt, I think this is a really good point. And I don't want to sound like I do think this is one of the great points you made earlier, was that like this kind of introduction of generative AI has laid bare so many of the problems that actually existed before. So when and I was a math major as an undergrad and kind of started my world in math ed, which is why I'm drawing on these mathy examples. And I know that many of the students in this class have a math background. But like let's take Calc 2. Calc 2, you're doing trig integrals, trig derivatives, all this kind of stuff. And constantly, when students are doing badly in that class, I would hear from them like, "Why are we learning this?" And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer. And they might say like, "The calculator can do this," and the best I can come up with is like, "Well, I guess we need to learn how the calculator does this." But it is so tedious and so difficult, and exactly the kind of thing that people have been critiquing about math education for a long time. This kind of when will we use this? Even biologists and physicists and those who are likely to use trig derivatives and trig integrals and what have you would simply never do them by hand for the rest of their career. It would just be it would be a totally anomalous and bizarre thing to do. And so I think that those kinds of things that these AIs are kind of calling our attention to are a good moment for faculty and teachers to really critically reflect about what are we doing here and what parts of this curriculum is that like really a fair critique of. And I think Matt, that's exactly a great example of like, can you really construct an entire computer science course in which the practices the students are doing have nothing to do with the practices that computer scientists are using? you will have missed something quite important if you constructed your course that way.
Right.
Yeah, I do think though. So like I'm thinking, so over the summer, for example, I ran a research camp and we had people with different coding abilities, right? And for students that had one or two courses in Python, for example, or in any computer language, but that had that experience of actually coding and doing some level of debugging and understanding basic things like loops and functions and classes and stuff, they could use ChatGPT and their work was much accelerated versus students that were just using ChatGPT and didn't have any experience coding. Like what you said, would it be easier for me to just code it myself?
Right.
They couldn't do that. And a lot of times the answer to that question is yes. And you don't know that unless you know, at least the basics of how to code. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really interesting point. It's like it seems like we need some level of proficiency before those tools become, because the tools are so seductive, right? And we
Right.
need some level of proficiency, it seems, before those tools really become useful.
Right. I think it's interesting. That actually reminds me, like I said, I never use ChatGPT or rarely use it for my work outside of like computing. But over the summer, I wanted to read this essay by this French philosopher, and most of his stuff is translated. I don't speak French. Um, and I just had ChatGPT translate it. And
Yeah.
like, I'm not going to go back and I'm not even trying to learn French. So I think there's a level where someone might want to program something and they never want to learn any computing. And maybe that's okay too. But for someone that wants to do it, and this goes back to the motivation, like do these kids actually want to be programmers or see themselves as a computer scientist?
Yeah.
Then they'll want to learn it, and they'll want to learn it for the puzzle. Like even with like the computations you're talking about, Suraj, in math, you know who really likes doing that? People that really like math, because then they're looking for shortcuts and they're looking for new ways to solve the problem, and they can do it in different ways. And there are all kinds of competitions around that, and they do it for the joy of it, not for the mathematics, not for the like the reward of it, right? Like at the end, not the instrumental part of it. And they're the people that actually do want to go back and relook at some of this stuff. So it's the same thing with like your novice computer programmers, right? Like why do they want to do it? If they just want to get it done and they can get it done with ChatGPT, maybe that's okay too. But if they never learn what a loop is or what recursion is, then they'll never know like why to why to do it. And if they see themselves as someone who's part of that community, then they'll want to take the time, hopefully, or we'll give them the opportunity to take the time to learn those fundamentals.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sparks a lot for me. And I want to stress to, or not stress, but mention to the folks who are listening, that educational research is actually extraordinarily complicated. People tend to think of it as something that anybody can do, and that's true to some degree, but there's quite a lot of assumptions baked into it. So we ask questions like, what is the purpose of school and what does it mean to learn? And those assumptions really color all of the research that might follow. And so I say that to say, like, part of your comment, Matt, made me think about like the very human questions behind AI. Like, what does it mean to live a good life? There was this thing going around on the Twitter or the TikTok or whatever that was
Hmm.
somebody saying like, oh, like you no longer have to watch, 10 episodes of a show. You can just ask ChatGPT to summarize it for you. And in this way, I can watch many shows a week. Or like I no longer have to read the books. I just ask ChatGPT to summarize the New York Times bestsellers for me, and then I can be in the conversations about them. And naturally, this person got totally dunked on correctly by the internet because what are you talking about? Like you're really trying to save time watching like television? Like that is supposed to be fun and
Hmm.
pleasant. And what you said about problem solving made me think about all of the kinds of things that we do where there are answers. Like, for example, I very frequently will do the New York Times crossword because I find it so pleasant. But at any given point, I can start Googling things. I can
Sure.
like ask for the answer key. It's not like that wasn't available to me, but as a leisure activity, that would do like why would I do that? What is the advantage of like opening the crossword and then looking up the answers? And I think that especially in the higher education levels, that's something that faculty sometimes encounter a kind of tension point, sometimes in gen ed classes or sometimes with majors, is that we like we really want it to be the case that students want to learn the thing that they want to learn. And I was teaching a class this summer, Matt, you of course were there, a class for pre-service teachers who are about to start teaching in school. And it was kind of a transformative experience for me because typically I'll assign readings and students don't necessarily want to read them. It's always kind of a chore to get them to do the readings. And in this class, the students were so excited to read anything because they knew that they were going to go into a classroom and teach for the first time in 6 weeks. And literally anything that I was like, maybe read this, it might be helpful. They were like, absolutely, we'll read. And that was really a lovely and affirming experience for me as a teacher too, because I was like, oh, well, this is like one of the first times in my career where I feel like I'm not fighting with people to do the reading. And that's exactly what it should be, right? When you're working with especially advanced majors in some particular topic, you assume there is some motivation. Now, of course, I do think that it's a different question when you're talking about sixth graders and what have you. Like I
Yeah,
don't think
agreed.
I don't extrapolate that case, all the way down into the lower grades. But I do think that is like that kind of aesthetic or pleasurable component is important too. And that goes back to what I was saying about good quality writing, right? Like if you kind of send something to ChatGPT and you say, can you make this writing better? Here's my draft. Can you make it better? And it sends you something back. There's some aesthetic judgment you're performing about what you think is better writing. And that is like that has to do with your own visions of what you think is good writing or what you think is beautiful.
Totally. Totally. Thanks. I appreciate that. So if I think about my students that have gone on to teach, and I talked to a couple of them in preparing for this, and I asked them, what is the number one thing that you're getting out of AI, as a teacher now in the schools? Um, the thing that they told me was, I think, time, basically, right? Like they're using largely generative AI, but not exclusively, but largely generative AI to save time in preparing for class and trying to grade things and that kind
Yeah.
of. And I'm wondering if you guys have received any such feedback about that, about how teachers are currently using it to save time, and what things, because you guys are in touch with a lot more people that are going into the classroom, so what things do they wish AI could actually deliver on from that perspective, from like a time or like a classroom management perspective?
I mean, we have like this long history, right? Right. And probably even in your class, you might see some of the overlap of learning research and AI research, right? Like you've got Papert and Minsky, like they're doing both at the same time. They're trying to understand how computers might think and how people might think. And then like in the 80s, in the like symbolic AI era, we had all these cognitive tutors and intelligent computing systems. And I don't mind them. I don't think they're like the greatest use of computing. They're not going to really change anything. Uh, but I wouldn't mind like a good ChatGPT tutor that could actually give a little bit of one-on-one support. I think it's almost there, and it's some of the research I'm looking at with bilingual students to see how it could be a better tutor for students that's are learning English but speak another language and wanted to study academic content. But I'm sure there are a lot of domains where it's not quite trustworthy, but could almost actually help give a little support and free up teachers' time that way in remediation or even in like more advanced things like, um, talk to ChatGPT about this topic while most of us are going to work on something else. So I could see that being like a real like boon to a classroom teacher. Always trying to find more time, like just time on task is a huge thing. If your students are actually learning something more of the time they're in school, that's basically the most important thing we could do is have them actually doing academic work for more of the time. And I
Yeah.
think we could get there. Terms of teachers we know using it, generate like lesson plan ideas or unit ideas, I think is a big one. I think writing There's a lot of like bureaucratic writing that they have to do. So having it do some of that work for them where it's very formulaic and it's well suited to ChatGPT. I've known
Mhm.
teachers take advantage of it for that for that kind of stuff. Suraj, what have you seen?
Yeah. So I think that I'm having two thoughts. I have filled like so many little sheets of things that have been coming up,
You
and
could use a bigger notebook, maybe.
yeah, maybe. Maybe I should ask ChatGPT what I should comment on. So I want to actually go back a little bit, and then I'll talk about the teacher question. But something that has been bubbling up for me as we were talking about the math examples is a really, really, really important idea in the learning sciences that for some people would differentiate the learning sciences from educational psychology, and we're not getting into that. It's not a learning theory class, but is the idea that disciplines matter and what is being learned matters. And it's very difficult to talk about learning in general terms. And it only makes sense to talk about learning when you're talking about what is being learned and by whom and with whom and to what ends. Then we can start understanding how learning happens. But without specifying those things, it doesn't make sense to talk about how people learn in some general sense. And I bring that up to say these when we talk about the use of AI for students in the classroom, it really matters which classroom we're talking about. So some of the computer science examples differ quite a lot from, a literature class where students are reading The Great Gatsby and what you might ask them to do with that literary analysis from like a history class. And this is an example where the AI has laid bare the facts, right? So history classes are supposed to be not only about what happened, but how we construct our understanding of what happens and historiography, and we know that these kind of didactic ways of teaching what happened don't work because a wide variety of people will still happily argue that the Civil War was not about slavery, which is a profound failure of an American education system and says something about the idea that teaching people what is like not nearly enough for that to stick, but teaching people how to reason about history, right? Or like, here's one, like people take Spanish in high school. And like Spanish, right? Like one can easily imagine somebody using ChatGPT to do their Spanish homework. But like, what are we doing here? Because if you want to acquire the Spanish language, you have to acquire it. You over here. And so I say all that to say when we speculate about the use of ChatGPT in the classrooms, it really matters which classroom and what subject and what age group and all like. As to how teachers are using ChatGPT, I've seen pretty much what you've seen. Lesson plan crafting, when Matt talks about the bureaucratic paperwork that teachers have to do, sometimes they are required, especially new teachers, to submit lesson plans to instructional coaches or principals or something in some advanced time frame. And so they might write up kind of a lesson plan in bullet points and then ask ChatGPT to format it in this kind of bureaucratic way that matches the learning outcomes and such. I do think some teachers are probably using it to provide feedback and grading, which is something I would be extraordinarily cautious about. But I have understood it to be these time-saving things, and I think if we're going to talk about that, it's totally necessary to talk about teachers' working conditions. Many teachers in the United States work under truly bad working conditions in the sense that they might, for example, be teaching 5 different classes in a day with 30 people each, meaning that there's 150 pieces of student work all the time. They're working these full days and then might have to go home at night and do grading and lesson plan the next day. There often are not free periods. There are often expected extracurricular supervision. And sometimes teachers don't even know what class they're teaching until a day or two before the school year begins. And so I do think that, whenever I think about teachers' use of ChatGPT, even if I have some critiques of it, I never want to separate that from the fact of these difficult working conditions. And I think, teachers who are working in great working conditions, who might have fewer preps or whatever, are probably actually doing really fascinating and innovative things with AI. But something like grading student work with AI seems like a big problem to me. Um, but that's the kind of thing I've been seeing is really
But
lesson planning. People will kind of ask ChatGPT,
right.
today we're learning about this. What are some discussion questions about it? Or today we're learning about this. What are some activities I could do with students about it?
For me, once the teacher is like put in that position where they're using AI to grade work, they've already set up everything wrong. Like they've gone so far off track that's like they should rethink what they're doing. Like they assign too many things that need grading and they're not important enough is basically what it says to me, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I try to never assign things that I can't actually grade or give feedback on, and it doesn't always work. And sometimes I'm like, oh, what was I thinking? I can't believe I did this to myself. And then I need to rethink that assignment in the way it works, right? So I think that's with a lot of our new teachers, like they'll get into that position, and then the only way out is maybe um,
Hmm.
using AI grading or something. But let's say that you need to write like a summary for your AP, your assistant principal or something on every student in your class, and you have their grades and you have like a couple comments about them. Have ChatGPT actually write that in sentences. Like, I'm okay with that. I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. Um, you
Yeah.
you set up the template as a prompt and then it can produce it for you. That kind of thing, like just save some work. Um, it's possible I might have used it in some of our accreditation work, you
Sure.
know. So it's like very formulaic things need to be formatted in a certain way. I know what I want it to say, but like it's just like helps me get there faster and like I think a
Yeah.
lot of professional stuff. But then we think like, is this revolutionizing the workforce? No, it's like the most low level, tedious, inconsequential parts of the job. It's not
Right.
making me rethink what it means to be a researcher or what it means to teach ninth grade biology. It's really at the margins of it, right? It's not revolutionizing teaching biology. It's just like the least consequential parts of the job that are being touched by it. So that's where that hype cycle comes in. It's like, really, is it changing teaching? No. Also, you know, if you're like our new teachers this summer, they're part of New York City Teaching Fellows. They're high performing undergraduate students, or in some cases, grad students who've decided to come into the teaching profession. They were all STEM teachers for us. Like, it's not really going to make them a better teacher, and their job isn't really the problem of their job isn't knowing biology, right? It's like, how do they organize a group of students to be motivated for something that's inherently not motivating for them? Like, how do
Hmm.
they make it accessible to them? How do they take these abstract ideas that are notoriously hard to teach, like in a physics class, in a chemistry class, and then create it, present it in a way that's understandable? ChatGPT is not helping them with that. It's not really doing much to shift how that all works, at least not yet.
So I think that's really interesting because if I could, if I could like summarize our class so far in like one sentence, it would be that AI is like 90% hype. Uh, when you actually look at its actual capabilities, that it's what the industry, not us, but what the actual industry that's producing it says its total capabilities are. Not the hype guys, but the actual engineers building the stuff, that it's mostly hype. I wonder, since you made that comment, if either of you did either of you hear Bill Gates comment that in 10 years, something like 90% of teachers are going to just be AI online teachers?
So, see, that's just like a problem, and Bill Gates should stay out of education because, like, well, I have no love for Bill Gates or Microsoft. It's like the guy like totally like builds his empire on taking advantage of copyright and corrupt laws without inventing anything, and now we think he's going to solve like education problems.
Hmm.
So the problem isn't like a lack of strategies of teaching content, right? If I go, I live in Brooklyn, I know you live uptown, Surraj lives in Queens. If I go to my local school and things aren't going well, it's almost never that the teacher isn't like it's not the organization of the content of like a single lesson. That's the problem, right? It's all logistics and motivation and things that are well outside of what happened in the school. And that's where things start to go wrong. And it's not that a good teacher can't do a good job in that situation because Suraj and I have seen it plenty. Great teachers like doing great things in any school, in any environment. But what is this AI teacher going to say to the kids in Brooklyn in a struggling school that's going to change things, that's going to turn it around? It's just another situation where the advantage is going to go to already advantaged students, right? Like your
Hmm.
great student is going to be able to take even more advantage of AI. This is what they found with the MOOCs too. The people that were using them weren't like, um, kids that couldn't get into college and then had access to an MIT course. It was kids that were studying at Harvard that had access to an MIT course that they also used in their Harvard class, or that were at an advanced institute in India or Africa, and they were also doing these classes. So it just kind of accrued more power, knowledge, wealth to people that already had power, knowledge, and wealth. So that's what I think is going to happen in what Bill Gates is talking about. Not that it's going to revolutionize like a school in Crown Heights. So, like, what would that look like for Bill Gates?
Yeah, I too would like to take this opportunity to rail against Bill Gates' vision for education. Um,
That's one of my favorite topics, railing
this
against.
is this is inane. Okay, this idea that 90% of teachers will be AI. And it's inane for a few reasons. One, yawn. I've heard this before for the last 20 years, actually. It's not a new idea.
Well, I mean, since the 20s with radio, right? Like they've
Yeah.
been saying,
Right, like, and television is going to educate your children was actually a big idea when like cable became a household thing. So like we're not, and like I heard that Facebook is going to educate your children. And I've
unfortunately,
heard,
that one might have been true.
yes, well, Khan Academy is actually the one that I'm thinking of the most. When Khan Academy became big, everybody was like, well, and when I say everybody, I mean Salman Khan. It's not
Right.
Salman Khan, right? That's a famous actor. I don't know.
Sal,
But
yeah,
that's almost
Sal
his.
Khan.
Sal Khan. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Um, would go out in these TED Talks. Oh, he loved his TED Talks and be like, we don't need school anymore. I solved it by doing these problems on YouTube. What are you talking about? You sound not like you have any idea what's going on. But I also think that the problems are deeper than the fact that this has come up many times before and it has never been true. The problem is that schools are social institutions, ones that we're seeing being attacked, by the way, quite a lot right now. They're not entirely, and in fact, they're even maybe not even primarily about learning. So there's one thing there. There's an issue of motivation. Like you're telling me you're going to get students to stand in front of a screen all day and they'll like that talking to the AI. They'll prefer that to talking to a teacher they like or to a friend who's sitting next to them. Seems unlikely. I think when you talk to any of the students, including the students who are in this class who experienced pandemic pedagogy and all of their classes going on Zoom, I think most students found that to be a pretty dreadful experience and were relieved to be able to come back to a face-to-face schooling environment because of all sorts of reasons, not the least of which are human interaction as being fundamental to learning, and as learning as also schools as part of enculturating people into a social world, right? And learning how to deal with social others. And then the last piece that I think is really important is the idea that as humans, we are constantly creating knowledge that does not yet exist. We're learning things that nobody has ever learned before. We're not just trying to learn something that has happened before. And sometimes that can get obscured when we're teaching students history or math in terms of this prior knowledge. This is what math is. But it
Right.
becomes very apparent in lots of different conversations. For example, this is a classic conversation I do with students all the time. There's a real problem, stay with me. There's a real problem with dog pee in New York City. Dogs are peeing on trees. And because of the strong nitrogen content in dog food and dog urine, it's killing the trees. And this is a big old problem. And how do we solve it? Do we outlaw dogs in New York City? Do we find some sort of tree that is resistant to dog pee? Do we remove all of the cars in the city so that dogs can pee in the gutter? I do this conversation with students every year as a way of demonstrating what it looks like to critically wrestle with problems that nobody has solved, but
Mhm.
that provide deep and rich learning opportunities about social life and about science, right?
Mhm.
And these are the kinds of things that the best classrooms do is they engage students in the learning of things that have not happened yet, right? So when we like all get together in class and we read The Great Gatsby, it's not always about like, oh, what do you think the green light means? This is what person X thinks and this person Y thinks. Some of it is about like, what do you think about riches? Like, what do you think about the American dream? Like, how are you Like, what does this mean to you? Does it speak to you? And if you don't like it, like, why didn't this book work for you? And would this other book work for you? And that is like stuff that you cannot, an AI simply cannot do for you.
Yeah.
Like, and so it's, and that kind of learning, what Engstrom calls expansive learning, is the ideal target of schooling. And I just find that, the idea that AI replaces teachers relies on the idea that learning is about taking knowledge that somebody else already has and putting it in your head. If learning's not about that, then, by the way,
Yeah.
that model is called the banking model of education, and it is heavily critiqued by the very, very influential educational theorist Paulo Freire.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you guys so much. I really, really,
Another fun day of diatribes.
Yeah.
um,
It's super fun, Josh. Thanks for
yeah.
having us.
Do you guys have any final thoughts before we call it?
I think I've said literally every thought I've had as soon as I had it, but I certainly am happy to. I'm really eager to, in fact, hear your students' responses to this
I was
conversation.
going to say the same thing. Like, I'm curious, this is a new class and like where you guys go and thinking of your class as like a true knowledge building community and thinking through some of these problems. So, just keep us up to date and we want to hear what you all are thinking about.
Yeah, it actually is an example of what I just said, in the sense that the folks in this class are wrestling with things that nobody has the answer to yet and may never. But you cannot ask the AI, like, what do you think we should do about AI in education? You got to do that, right? So,
Oh, so I have something funny to tell you. So, and then we'll call it. Speaking of that, so I've been, like I said, if I could call this course something else, it would be AI is 90% hype. And so one of my students said, "We'll see." And so they like, after I gave like a end of class summary of the papers that we had been reading, like
Yeah.
all of them together. Um, one of them went and typed into Claude like, "Is the AI craze mostly hype?" And Claude was like, "Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Here's 13 different arguments for why."
that is funny. And like Grok is like this too, in the sense that, Grok, Elon Musk's Twitter AI, like will
Yeah.
always say these things and then Musk disagrees with them. So then like they go back and they retool the AI so that it
Retool it.
doesn't say those things,
Right.
which by the way, it just exposes. The other thing I was going to say is about, I am really curious about the students' perceptions of AI. And part of that is I think as educators, sometimes we accidentally go like, all students want to do is use AI, all students want to do is cheat. And that's simply not true, right? Like many students don't. And the New York Times ran a really interesting article, I think it was the New York Times recently, that was about students who were like, I'm really mad that all my professors are using ChatGPT to teach me, and
Right.
all the people next to me in class are using ChatGPT, and I feel like I'm like in a science fiction novel because I came here to actually do the work of reading and writing. And so I am really curious about, I would love to hear your students, whether they have some reflection piece or I don't know what you do in the class, right? But anything that might be forwarded on to us, please. And then I'll also mention that Matt and I teach in the Ed Tech and the Learning Sciences program, and we're happy to engage in further conversation about this, or maybe even recommend a spring class to you. I think we're running a spring class on AI literacies in education, I believe, that Dr. Aaron Hung is
Yeah.
teaching, I think. So please keep in touch and let us know what comes of this.
Okay, will do. Thanks, guys.